Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as burdens, wrapped in dust and disappointment. At 61, Will Brody thought he'd learned this lesson, but life had one surprise waiting in Montana. When his estranged uncle dies and leaves him a crumbling ranch, Brody inherits broken fences, a leaky roof, and Clementine, a stubborn donkey who seems to know secrets that died with the old man. The land is worthless, buildings are falling apart, and Brody's ready to walk away. But Clementine has other plans. One evening, she starts digging near a twisted oak. But what secret was worth hiding for decades? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This remarkable journey is just beginning, and you definitely won't want to miss what amazing things come next. The letter from the lawyer had arrived on a Tuesday morning in December, delivered to Will Brody's small apartment above the feed store in Billings, where he'd been working for the past 3 years. The envelope bore the letterhead of Morrison and Associates, a law firm he'd never heard of, and inside was news that Uncle Frank had died 2 weeks earlier. Natural causes, the letter said, as if death at 87 required explanation. Will set the letter on his kitchen table next to his lukewarm coffee and stared out the window at the grey Montana sky. Frank Brody, his father's brother, the man who'd raised him after his parents died in a car wreck when Will was 12. The same man Will hadn't spoken to in over 20 years, not since their bitter argument about choices and responsibilities and what it meant to be a man. The lawyer's letter was clinical in its efficiency. Frank had left him the ranch, all 640 acres of it, plus the house, the barn, and whatever livestock remained. There was also mention of personal effects, and one specific bequest that made Will's throat tighten. An old donkey named Clementine, described in Frank's will as the most honest companion a man could ask for. Will had driven out to the ranch 3 days later, taking the familiar dirt road that wound through the crazy mountains. He'd grown up on this land, spent his teenage years mending fences and hauling hay, learning the hard lessons that only come from working with your hands and watching the sky for weather. The drive felt like traveling backwards through time, each mile peeling away years until he was 17 again, angry and restless and desperate to escape what he saw as a life sentence of isolation and endless chores. The ranch looked smaller than he remembered, and infinitely more tired. The white paint on the farmhouse had faded to grey, with patches peeling like old skin. The porch sagged on one side, and several windows were covered with plywood. The barn's roof showed gaps where shingles had blown away, and the corral fence listed at dangerous angles. Everything spoke of years of deferred maintenance and the gradual surrender that comes when a man grows old alone. But it was the donkey that surprised him most. Clementine stood in the small pasture behind the house, grey and shaggy with age, her ears pricked forward as she watched Will's truck pull up the drive. She was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 11 hands high, with intelligent dark eyes and a way of holding her head that suggested opinions about everything. When Will climbed out of his truck, she ambled over to the fence and regarded him with what he could only describe as recognition. "You must be Clementine," he said, extending his hand. She sniffed his fingers, then allowed him to scratch behind her ears. Her coat was winter-thick and soft, and there was something profoundly calming about her presence. The house key was where Frank had always kept it, under the third stone from the porch steps. Inside, the rooms held the accumulated stillness of a life lived in solitude. Frank's coffee cup still sat in the sink, and his reading glasses lay folded on the kitchen table next to a worn, paperback Western. The living room was spare but comfortable, dominated by Frank's old recliner and a stone fireplace that had warmed countless evenings. Will moved through the rooms slowly, remembering. Here was the kitchen where Frank had taught him to cook simple meals: beans and cornbread, fried eggs, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. There was the living room where they'd sit after supper, Frank reading while Will did homework, the only sounds the ticking clock and the occasional pop from the fire. And there, tucked between Frank's chair and the bookshelf, was an old wooden crate that Will hadn't seen in decades. Inside the crate were photographs, dozens of them, mostly black and white images from another era. Will recognized his grandparents, stern-faced pioneers who'd homesteaded this land in 1923. There were pictures of Frank as a young man, impossibly handsome in his army uniform, and later photos of him working the ranch with Will's father. But it was the photograph at the bottom of the pile that stopped Will cold. It showed Frank and a woman Will had never seen before, both of them young and laughing, standing beside a painted pony near the old oak tree that grew behind the house. The woman was beautiful in the way that only old photographs could capture, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold secrets. On the back, in Frank's careful handwriting, were the words, "Margaret and me, summer 1962. Some roads we never traveled." Will studied the photograph for a long time, trying to reconcile this laughing, carefree version of his uncle with the serious, sometimes stern man who'd raised him. Frank had never married, never spoke of women except in the abstract, and Will had always assumed his uncle simply preferred solitude. But this photograph suggested a different story, one of paths not taken and choices that echoed across decades. The rest of the house told similar stories of a life lived quietly, but not without depth. Frank's bedroom was neat as a military barracks, but his closet held not just work clothes, but a good suit, still wrapped in plastic from the dry cleaner. The bathroom cabinet contained not just necessities, but a bottle of expensive cologne, barely used. And in the kitchen, tucked behind the everyday dishes, Will found a set of fine china that had never seen a meal. These were the possessions of a man who'd prepared for occasions that never came, who'd hoped for company that never arrived. They spoke of optimism maintained in the face of disappointment, of a heart that remained open despite years of solitude. Will spent his first night at the ranch in Frank's old room, lying in the narrow bed where his uncle had slept for decades. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind in the eaves and the occasional sound of Clementine moving around in her pasture. It was the kind of deep quiet that city dwellers never experience, a silence so complete it almost had weight. He woke before dawn to the sound of Clementine braying, a harsh but somehow musical call that seemed to demand attention. When he looked out the window, he saw her standing near the back fence, her head turned toward the old oak tree that dominated the back of the property. She brayed again, then began walking in that direction, looking back as if expecting him to follow. Will dressed quickly and stepped outside into the sharp December air. His breath formed clouds in the cold, and frost crunched under his boots as he walked toward the pasture. Clementine met him at the gate, pushing against his hand with her nose, in what seemed like urgency. "What is it, girl?" he asked, unlatching the gate. "What's got you so worked up?" She led him toward the oak tree, a massive specimen that had probably been growing when his great-grandparents first settled the land. Its trunk was easily 6 feet across, gnarled and scarred by decades of weather, but still strong. Clementine stopped beside it and began pawing at the ground with her front hoof, scraping away the thin layer of snow to reveal the dark earth beneath. Will watched her for several minutes, trying to understand what had captured her attention. The tree looked the same as it always had, ancient and permanent, and somehow reassuring in its endurance. But Clementine continued her pawing, becoming more insistent, almost frantic in her movements. "There's nothing there, Clementine," Will said gently. "Just old tree roots and dirt." But even as he spoke, he noticed something that made him look more carefully. The ground around the base of the tree was slightly different in color, darker and more rich than the surrounding soil. And now that he thought about it, the pattern wasn't random. It formed a rough rectangle, perhaps 3 feet by 2 feet, as if the earth had been disturbed and refilled. Clementine stopped her pawing and looked at him directly, her dark eyes holding an intelligence that seemed almost human. Then she brayed once more, a sound that carried across the empty landscape like a question waiting for an answer. Will knelt beside the dark patch of earth and brushed away more snow. The soil underneath was definitely different, looser and more worked than the hard-packed clay that surrounded it. "Someone had dug here and not too long ago," The earth had settled, but not completely, leaving subtle signs that spoke to anyone who knew how to read the land. He looked up at Clementine, who stood watching him with what seemed like satisfaction. The morning sun was beginning to clear the mountains to the east, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of gold and pink. The beauty of the moment wasn't lost on him, standing beside this ancient tree with an old donkey who seemed to know secrets he could only guess at. "Frank," he said quietly, speaking to the memory of his uncle, and maybe to the land itself, "what were you keeping from me?" The wind picked up, stirring the bare branches of the oak tree and sending a few late leaves spiraling to the ground. Clementine nuzzled his shoulder gently, and Will had the strange sensation that he was standing at the edge of a mystery that would change everything he thought he knew about his family, his past, and the legacy that had been left in his care. Will spent the rest of that morning walking the property, reacquainting himself with land he'd once known, as well as his own heartbeat. The ranch encompassed 640 acres of rolling hills and meadowland, with Willow Creek cutting through the southern boundary and the crazy mountains rising like cathedral spires to the north. It was beautiful country, the kind that got into a man's blood and never quite let go. But it was also hard country that demanded everything and gave back only what was earned through sweat and stubbornness. The cattle were long gone, sold off over the years as Frank grew older and less able to manage a full herd. The barn held only the lingering scent of hay and horses, and the empty stalls seemed to echo with the ghosts of animals that had once called this place home. In the tack room, Will found Frank's old saddle, still supple despite years of neglect, and a collection of bridles and bits that spoke to a lifetime spent working with horses. But it was Clementine who drew his attention back to the mystery beneath the oak tree. Every time he passed the old tree during his tour of the property, she would position herself near the disturbed earth and watch him with those knowing eyes. Her behavior was unlike any animal he'd ever encountered, purposeful and almost urgent, as if she carried a message she couldn't quite communicate. By afternoon, Will's curiosity had overcome his skepticism. He retrieved a shovel from the barn and returned to the oak tree, where Clementine waited with what seemed like vindication. The December air was crisp and thin, making his breath visible as he knelt beside the dark patch of earth. "All right, girl," he said to the donkey. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." The first shovelful of dirt came up easily, confirming his suspicion that the ground had been disturbed relatively recently. The soil was dark and rich, different from the clay that characterized most of the ranch. Someone had brought in different earth, perhaps to conceal whatever lay beneath. Will dug carefully, mindful that he might be disturbing something important. The hole deepened gradually, and Clementine watched every movement with unwavering attention. At 2 feet down, the shovel struck something solid with a metallic ring that made Will's pulse quicken. Brushing away the dirt with his hands, he uncovered the corner of what appeared to be a metal box. His heart hammered as he cleared more soil, revealing a weathered steel container about the size of a large tackle box. It was heavy, much heavier than its size suggested, and secured with an old-fashioned hasp and padlock that had long since rusted into uselessness. Will lifted the box from its earthen hiding place and set it on the ground beside the hole. Clementine immediately moved closer, sniffing the container with obvious interest. The lock broke away with a sharp twist, and Will felt his breath catch as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, were items that spoke to secrets kept for decades. The first thing he pulled out was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age but still intact. Beneath that were several envelopes tied with ribbon, a small velvet jewelry box, and what appeared to be legal documents rolled in a rubber tube. At the bottom of the box, wrapped separately, was a key, old brass, ornate, and unlike anything Will had ever seen. He opened the journal first, recognizing Frank's handwriting immediately. The entries were dated, beginning in 1962 and continuing sporadically through the 1980s. The first entry made Will sink back on his heels in astonishment. "Margaret came by again today. Asked about the land her father left behind, the piece that borders our north pasture. Told her what I've told her before, that Grandpa Brody bought that section fair and square in 1923, paid good money for it when the Macready family was hurting for cash. But Margaret insists there's more to the story. Says her grandfather never would have sold that particular piece, not for any amount of money. There's something about that land that meant everything to the Macready clan. Something about what's buried there. Will's hands trembled as he turned the pages. The entries told the story of a relationship that had clearly meant more to Frank than any family member had ever known. Margaret Macready had been the granddaughter of the family that had sold land to Will's great-grandfather, and she'd spent years trying to reclaim what she believed was rightfully hers. But as Will read deeper into the journal, the story became more complex. Margaret hadn't just been fighting for land, she'd been fighting for truth. According to her research, the Macready family had never intended to sell the north section. That particular piece of property held something of tremendous value, something that old Silas Macready had sworn to protect with his life. The journal entries revealed Frank's growing love for Margaret and his increasing discomfort with his family's version of events. By 1965, he was writing about secret meetings, clandestine research trips to the county courthouse, and a growing conviction that his grandfather had not been entirely honest about how he'd acquired the Macready land. Margaret showed me the original survey today, read one entry from the summer of 1966. The boundaries don't match what we've always believed. If she's right, if the original Macready claim included mineral rights to the entire north section, then everything changes. We've been sitting on something that never belonged to us, something that could change both our families' fortunes forever. We'll set the journal aside and open the first of the envelopes. Inside were photographs, but these weren't family pictures. They showed geographical surveys, mineral samples, and what appeared to be core samples from drilling operations. The dates on the photos spanned several decades, and many were marked with coordinates that Will didn't recognize. The second envelope contained correspondence between Frank and various geological survey companies, dating from the late 1960s through the early 1980s. The letters were filled with technical language about mineral deposits, extraction possibilities, and something called rare earth elements that apparently had tremendous value in modern manufacturing. But it was the third envelope that changed everything. Inside were legal documents, including a deed that made Will's vision blur with shock. The deed, dated 1923, showed that Silas Macready had indeed sold land to Will's great-grandfather, but not the land that the Brody family had always claimed. The actual sale had been for a different section entirely, a piece of property on the southern boundary that held no particular value, the north section. The land that the Brody family had farmed and grazed for nearly a century had never legally belonged to them. According to these documents, it still belonged to the Macready heirs, and mineral surveys from the 1970s suggested it contained deposits worth millions of dollars. Will sat in stunned silence. The papers scattered around him like pieces of a puzzle that reformed everything he thought he knew about his family's history. Frank had discovered the truth about the land and had spent decades trying to figure out how to make things right. The journal entries from the 1970s and 1980s showed his uncle's growing anguish as he realized the magnitude of his family's inadvertent theft. "I found Margaret again," read one of the final entries. Dated 1987. "She married that banker from Helena and moved to California, but she still dreams about this place. Told her I know the truth now, that I want to make things right. But how do you give back a lifetime? How do you undo 70 years of good faith farming on land that was never yours to begin with? She deserves everything. The land, the mineral rights, the future that was stolen from her family. But giving it to her means destroying mine." The final entry in the journal was dated just 2 years ago, written in Frank's increasingly shaky handwriting. "Clementine knows. Animals always know when something isn't right. She paused at the spot where I buried all this evidence, like she's trying to tell me something. Maybe it's time to stop carrying this alone. Maybe it's time to let someone else decide what justice looks like. Will looked up at Clementine, who had been standing quietly beside him throughout his reading. The donkey met his gaze steadily, and for a moment Will could swear he saw understanding in her dark eyes. "You knew," he said quietly. "You knew all along." Clementine snorted softly and nuzzled the brass key that Will still held in his palm. The key was warm from his grip, and something about its weight and design suggested it opened something important. Something that would complete the story Frank had started, but never finished. As the December sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of purple and gold, Will carefully repacked the box and carried it toward the house. His world had shifted fundamentally in the space of a few hours, and he needed time to understand what Frank's discovery meant for his future. But one thing was already clear. The ranch he'd inherited wasn't just a burden or a gift. It was a trust, and until he understood the full extent of Frank's secret, he couldn't in good conscience make any decisions about selling or staying. The mystery that Clementine had led him to was just the beginning of a much larger story, one that would challenge everything he thought he knew about family, honor, and the weight of the past. That night, Will sat at Frank's kitchen table with the contents of the metal box spread before him, like evidence in a trial that had never taken place. The brass key lay in the center of it all, catching the light from the overhead fixture and seeming to mock him with its secrets. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the loose windows and reminding him of how alone he was with this burden of knowledge. He'd read through Frank's journal twice more, and each reading only deepened his understanding of his uncle's torment. Frank had been a good man, caught in an impossible situation, honor-bound to his family's legacy, but unable to ignore the truth of what they'd unknowingly taken from another family. The journal entries painted a picture of a man slowly being torn apart by the weight of secrets and the impossibility of making things right, without destroying everything he'd been taught to value. Will found himself thinking about Margaret Macready, the young woman in the photograph who had grown old, fighting for what belonged to her family. According to Frank's journal, she'd married and moved to California, but that had been decades ago. Was she still alive? Did she have children, grandchildren who might have inherited her determination to reclaim the Macready legacy? The legal documents were clear enough for someone with common sense to understand, even without a law degree. The Brody family had been farming the wrong section of land for nearly a century, believing in good faith that they owned property that had never been theirs to begin with. It was an honest mistake, the kind that happened when surveys were imprecise and record-keeping was haphazard. But an honest mistake that had compounded over decades into something much larger. Will picked up the brass key again, turning it over in his weathered hands. It was clearly old, probably dating from the early 1900s, and its design suggested it opened something more substantial than a simple door or chest. The key was too large and ornate for a house lock, too substantial for a jewelry box. Whatever it opened had been important enough for Frank to include it with the most significant documents of his life. A sudden braying from outside made Will look up from his contemplation. Clementine was calling again, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. He glanced at the clock on the stove. Nearly 11 o'clock, well past the time when any sensible animal should be settling in for the night. Will pulled on his coat and stepped outside into the bitter December air. The sky was clear and filled with more stars than any city dweller ever saw, the kind of night sky that reminded a person how small they were in the vast scheme of things. Clementine stood near the barn, silhouetted against the white snow, and when she saw him approaching, she began walking toward the old structure with purpose. The barn was Frank's domain, a place where Will had spent countless hours as a teenager learning to work with his hands and understand the rhythms of rural life. The main doors stood slightly ajar, and Clementine pushed through them with the confidence of an animal who knew every inch of the property. Inside, the barn was dark except for the moonlight streaming through gaps in the roof. Will found the old lantern that Frank had always kept by the door and managed to get it lit after several tries. The warm yellow light revealed the familiar interior, empty stalls, feed bins, and the accumulated tools and equipment of a working ranch. But Clementine wasn't interested in the main barn. She was standing near the back wall, pawing at what appeared to be a section of wooden planking that looked slightly different from the rest. Will approached slowly, holding the lantern high, and realized that this part of the wall was actually a door, so well fitted and weathered that it blended seamlessly with the surrounding boards. "What is it, girl?" Will murmured, running his hand along the edges of the hidden door. What else was Frank hiding? His fingers found a small keyhole, nearly invisible in the old wood, and Will's pulse quickened as he recognized its size and shape. The brass key from the buried box fitted perfectly, turning with a satisfying click that echoed in the quiet barn. The hidden door swung open to reveal a narrow room that Will had never known existed. His lantern light illuminated what appeared to be Frank's private office, a space where his uncle had kept his most important papers and conducted business he'd never shared with anyone. The room was small but organized, with a simple desk, a filing cabinet, and shelves lined with books and documents. But what drew Will's attention immediately was the wall map that dominated one side of the space. It showed the ranch and surrounding area in meticulous detail, with different colored pins marking various locations and property boundaries drawn in multiple colors of ink. Will set the lantern on the desk and studied the map more carefully. The red pins marked the boundaries of the original Brody property, the land his great-grandfather had legitimately purchased in 1923. The blue pins showed the McCready claim, the land that the Brody family had been farming for decades without legal right. But it was the green pins that made Will's breath catch. They marked specific locations throughout the disputed territory, each one labeled with dates and numbers that corresponded to the geological surveys he'd found in the buried box. On the desk, Will found another journal, this one more recent and focused specifically on Frank's research into the mineral deposits on the McCready land. The entries were technical, filled with geological terms and survey data, but the implications were staggering. According to Frank's research, the disputed section contained some of the richest rare earth mineral deposits in the entire state of Montana. Rare earth elements, Will learned from Frank's careful notes, were essential components in everything from cell phones to wind turbines to electric car batteries. The demand for these materials had skyrocketed in recent decades, and the few known deposits in North America were worth fortunes that earlier generations could never have imagined. Frank's research suggested that the McCready land contained enough rare earth minerals to support a major mining operation for decades. Conservative estimates valued the deposits in the hundreds of millions of dollars, with some projections reaching into the billions if the minerals could be extracted efficiently. Will sank into Frank's desk chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was learning. This wasn't just about returning stolen land to its rightful owners. This was about a fortune that could transform lives, communities, entire regions. The responsibility of this knowledge felt crushing, far beyond anything he'd ever been asked to handle. In the filing cabinet, he found more correspondence, including letters from mining companies and geological survey firms that dated from just a few years ago. Frank had been actively researching the mineral rights situation right up until his death, trying to understand not just the legal implications, but the practical realities of returning such valuable property to its rightful owners. One letter from a mining consultant in Denver made Will's hands tremble as he read it. "Mr. Brody, based on our preliminary analysis of the core samples you provided, we believe the deposits on the property in question represent one of the most significant rare earth discoveries in North American history. If your concerns about the land ownership are valid, you're sitting on a situation that could involve billions of dollars in mineral rights. I strongly recommend you consult with both legal and financial experts before taking any action." Frank had been carrying this burden alone for decades, watching the value of the Macready claim grow from thousands to millions to potentially billions of dollars, while knowing that every day he delayed action was another day of injustice compounded. Will looked around the secret room, taking in the careful records and meticulous research that represented Frank's attempt to understand and ultimately resolve a situation that had begun as a simple surveying error nearly a century ago. His uncle had been a man of deep integrity, but also a man paralyzed by the enormity of the right thing to do. Clementine appeared in the doorway of the hidden room, and Will realized she'd been leading him to these discoveries all along. Somehow, this old donkey had understood that the secrets Frank carried needed to see daylight, that the truth could no longer remain buried in journals and hidden rooms. "Frank," Will said quietly, speaking to the memory of his uncle and the weight of his legacy, "you've left me quite a puzzle to solve." Outside, the wind continued to howl through the mountains, but inside the secret room, surrounded by the evidence of Frank's lifelong struggle with conscience and duty, Will began to understand that his inheritance was far more complex than a simple ranch and an old donkey. He'd inherited a moral crisis that would test everything he believed about family, justice, and the price of doing what was right. Will spent the next morning in town, sitting in the parking lot of the Crazy Mountain Diner with his cell phone pressed to his ear and a growing sense of dread in his stomach. He'd been making calls for 2 hours, starting with directory assistance and working his way through a maze of government offices, trying to understand the legal implications of what Frank had discovered. The conversation with the Montana Department of Natural Resources had been particularly enlightening. According to the clerk he'd spoken with, mineral rights disputes involving Native American tribal lands and early homestead claims were among the most complex legal issues in the state. When significant mineral deposits were involved, these cases could take decades to resolve and often required federal intervention. "Mr. Brody," the clerk had said, "if you're dealing with a situation involving rare earth minerals and disputed land ownership dating back to the 1920s, you're looking at something that could involve multiple state agencies, federal oversight, and potentially millions of dollars in legal fees. My advice would be to contact an attorney who specializes in mineral rights law before you do anything else." But it was the call to the county assessor's office that had shaken Will most deeply. According to their records, the section of land in question, the Macready claim that the Brody family had been farming, had been quietly purchased by a mining consortium called Western Extractive Industries just 6 months ago. The purchase price was listed as $47 million, paid to something called the Macready Family Trust. Will sat in his truck, staring at the phone number he'd written on a napkin. Western Extractive Industries had a corporate office in Denver, and according to their website, they specialized in rare earth mineral extraction from previously unexploited deposits in the American West. They were a subsidiary of a larger international mining conglomerate, with operations in 6 countries and annual revenues in the billions. The implications were staggering. While Will had been going through the motions of his ordinary life in Billings, working at the feed store and trying to figure out what to do with his retirement years, massive corporate interests had been quietly maneuvering to claim the land that Frank had spent decades agonizing over. The Macready heirs had apparently found a way to reclaim their heritage and had sold it to the highest bidder without ever setting foot on the property, but something about the timing bothered. Will Frank had died 8 weeks ago, and the land sale had occurred 6 months before that. Had Frank known about the sale? Had he been in contact with the Macready family before his death? The journal entries Will had read suggested that Frank had lost touch with Margaret Macready decades ago. But perhaps that wasn't the whole story. Will drove to the public library in Red Lodge, where a patient librarian helped him navigate online databases and search engines. What he found made his chest tighten with anxiety. Margaret Macready had indeed married and moved to California, where she'd raised 3 children and worked as a high school teacher until her retirement. But Margaret had died 5 years ago, and her estate had been inherited by her eldest daughter, Catherine McCready Chen, an environmental lawyer living in Portland, Oregon. The newspaper archives told a fascinating story. Catherine McCready Chen had spent years researching her family's history, including the land claims her grandmother had fought for unsuccessfully in the 1960s. In 2019, she'd filed a lawsuit against the Montana Land Title Commission, claiming that her family's mineral rights had never been properly transferred when the original land was sold in 1923. The lawsuit had dragged on for 4 years, involving multiple appeals and expert testimony from historians, surveyors, and geologists. But in early 2023, the Commission had ruled in favor of the McCready claim, determining that while the surface rights to the land had been legitimately sold to Will's great-grandfather, the mineral rights had been improperly transferred due to errors in the original survey and documentation. The ruling had restored the McCready family's claim to mineral rights worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and they'd immediately entered into negotiations with Western extractive industries for the development of what was being called the Crazy Mountain Rare Earth Project. Will printed out the relevant newspaper articles and sat in his truck reading them with growing amazement. Catherine McCready Chen had accomplished what her grandmother and mother had never been able to do. She'd reclaimed the McCready legacy through legal action rather than personal negotiation. But in doing so, she'd also opened the door to an industrial mining operation that would forever change the character of the land that 4 generations of Brodys had called home, according to the environmental impact statements that Western Extractive had filed with the state. The mining operation would involve open-pit extraction methods that would strip away hundreds of acres of topsoil and require the construction of processing facilities, access roads, and waste containment systems. The project was projected to employ several hundred workers and generate significant tax revenue for the county. But it would also effectively destroy the pastoral landscape that had defined the area for over a century. Will thought about Frank, alone on the ranch with his secrets and his guilty knowledge, watching the seasons turn and the cattle graze on land that wasn't legally theirs to use. Had his uncle known about Catherine McCready Chen's lawsuit? Had he been following the legal proceedings that would ultimately vindicate everything Margaret McCready had tried to tell him decades earlier? The answer came in the form of a manila envelope Will found tucked behind the filing cabinet in Frank's secret office. Inside were copies of all the court documents from Catherine's lawsuit, along with correspondence between Frank and Catherine herself. The first letter, dated 3 years ago, was from Catherine to Frank. Mr. Brody, I understand from my research that you knew my grandmother Margaret and that you may have information relevant to my family's land claim. I'm not interested in causing problems for your family, but I believe both our families deserve to know the truth about what happened in 1923. Would you be willing to speak with me about what my grandmother told you regarding the original land sale? Frank's response, written in his careful hand, was both honest and heartbreaking. Miss McCready Chen, your grandmother was a remarkable woman who tried for years to make me understand that my family had unknowingly built our lives on land that wasn't ours to claim. I was too young and stubborn to listen then, and too old and cowardly to act when I finally understood she was right. I have documents that I believe will support your legal claim, but I've spent 50 years trying to figure out how to honor both your family's rights and my family's good faith belief in what we owned. If you're determined to pursue this matter through the courts, I won't oppose you. Justice delayed is justice denied, and your family has waited long enough. The correspondence continued for 2 years, with Frank providing Catherine with copies of the original survey documents, mineral assessments, and even photographs of the disputed land. He'd been an active, if reluctant, participant in her legal victory, helping to document the case that would ultimately strip his family of property they'd never legally owned. But the final letter in the exchange sent just weeks before Frank's death, revealed the full complexity of his feelings. Catherine, I'm glad your family has finally received justice, but I confess I'm also deeply sad about what this means for the land itself. Your mining partners plan to turn some of the most beautiful country in Montana into an industrial extraction site. I understand the economic realities, and I know your family deserves compensation for decades of lost income, but I can't help wondering if there might be another way. The land has been good to my family for 4 generations, even if we never had the legal right to be there. Perhaps there's a solution that honors both your family's claim and the land's inherent value as something more than a commodity to be consumed. Will sat in the barn reading these letters while Clementine stood nearby, as if she understood the weight of what he was learning. Frank hadn't just been carrying the burden of stolen land. He'd been watching helplessly as the resolution of that theft led to the destruction of everything he'd spent his life protecting and nurturing. The mining operation was scheduled to begin construction in the spring, just a few months away. According to the project timeline, Western Extractive would start by building access roads and clearing the land for the open-pit excavation. Within 2 years, the rolling hills and meadows where Will had learned to work and live would be transformed into an industrial moonscape of heavy machinery and chemical processing facilities. Will understood now why Frank had seemed so melancholy in his final years, why he'd grown increasingly withdrawn and reluctant to maintain the ranch. His uncle had been watching the countdown to the end of a way of life, knowing that the resolution of his family's moral debt would ultimately destroy everything they'd built on that debt. The weight of this knowledge settled on Will's shoulders like a yoke he'd never asked to carry. He was now the sole keeper of Frank's secrets, the only person who understood the full complexity of what was about to happen to the land that had shaped 4 generations of his family. And with that knowledge came a responsibility he wasn't sure he was prepared to handle. Will spent 3 days wrestling with the decision before finally picking up the phone to call Catherine McCready Chen. He'd found her law office number in Portland and rehearsed what he wanted to say. But when her secretary put him through, the words came out in a jumbled rush that probably made him sound like a lunatic. Ms. McCready Chen, this is Will Brody. I'm Frank Brody's nephew, and I inherited his ranch when he passed away. I've been going through his papers, and I found the correspondence between you and my uncle about the mineral rights dispute. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Will could hear the sounds of a busy office in the background, phones ringing, voices in conversation, the normal bustle of professional life that seemed very far removed from his current reality. Mr. Brody, Catherine said finally, her voice careful and professional, I'm sorry for your loss. Your uncle was a remarkable man who helped my family reclaim something we thought was lost forever. How can I help you? Will found himself struggling to explain the complexity of what he'd discovered. How do you tell someone that you understand they've legally reclaimed their family's heritage, but that you're desperate to find a way to prevent that heritage from being destroyed in the process? I know that your family has every legal right to do whatever you want with the mineral claims, he began, and I know that my family never had any legal right to that land in the first place. But I'm wondering if there might be some way to discuss this situation before the mining operation begins. Another pause, longer this time. When Catherine spoke again, her voice had lost some of its professional distance. Mr. Brody, what exactly are you proposing? I don't know yet, Will admitted. But my uncle spent his final years agonizing over this situation, and I've inherited more than just his ranch. I've inherited his regret and his sense of responsibility. If there's any way to honor your family's claim while preserving the land itself, I'd like to explore it. Catherine was quiet for so long that Will began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weariness that made her sound much older than her 50-some years. Mr. Brody, can I be completely honest with you? Please. The mining contract with Western Extractive was signed 6 months ago, and breaking it would cost my family approximately $12 million in penalties and legal fees. The operation is scheduled to begin in March, which is less than 3 months away. Even if I wanted to explore alternatives, and I'm not saying I do, the practical realities make it nearly impossible. Will felt his heart sink. But Catherine wasn't finished. However, she continued, I will say that selling those mineral rights was the most difficult decision my family has ever made. My grandmother fought for that land for 40 years, not because she wanted to get rich, but because she believed it held something sacred that needed to be protected. When she died, she made me promise to reclaim our family's claim, but I don't think she ever imagined that reclaiming it would mean destroying it. What was sacred about it? Will asked. What did your grandmother think was so special about that particular section of land? That's a long story, Catherine said, and not one I can tell you over the phone. But if you're serious about exploring alternatives, and if you understand that you'd be working against tremendous legal and financial obstacles, then maybe we should meet in person. Will felt a spark of hope. You'd be willing to do that? My grandmother never stopped talking about Frank Brody, Catherine said. She always said he was a good man caught in an impossible situation, and that someday the truth would bring both our families back together. Maybe she was right. They arranged to meet the following week at the ranch. Catherine would fly into Billings and drive out to see the land that had been the source of her family's struggle for 4 generations. Will spent the intervening days trying to prepare for a conversation he didn't fully understand and couldn't entirely predict. He also spent time with Clementine, who had become his constant companion as he walked the property and tried to imagine what it would look like transformed into an open-pit mine. The donkey seemed to sense his emotional turmoil and stayed close, offering her silent presence as he grappled with questions that had no easy answers. On the morning Catherine was scheduled to arrive, Will woke early and took one more walk through the disputed section of land. The December landscape was stark but beautiful, with snow-covered hills rolling toward the mountains, and the kind of vast sky that made a person feel both infinitely small and deeply connected to something larger than themselves. Near the old oak tree where he'd found Frank's buried secrets, Will discovered something he'd missed in his earlier explorations. Hidden beneath the snow and partially concealed by fallen branches was a stone marker, roughly carved with symbols that looked Native American in origin. The marker was old, much older than any of the European settlement in the area, and it had been placed with obvious care and intention. Will brushed away the snow and studied the carvings more carefully. He wasn't an expert in Native American culture, but even he could recognize that the symbols seemed to represent natural elements: water, mountains, animals, and what appeared to be the earth itself. The marker had been deliberately positioned to align with the ancient oak tree, creating a relationship between human intention and natural growth that spoke to generations of respect and careful stewardship. When Catherine's rental car pulled up the ranch drive that afternoon, Will was waiting on the porch with Clementine beside him. Catherine was smaller than he'd expected. A compact woman in her early 50s with graying dark hair and her grandmother's intelligent eyes. She climbed out of the car slowly, like someone approaching a place that held too many memories to process all at once. "You must be Will," she said, extending her hand. "And this must be the famous Clementine that your uncle wrote about." Clementine approached Catherine with none of the caution she usually showed toward strangers. Instead, she allowed Catherine to scratch her ears and seemed to lean into the contact with obvious pleasure. "She likes you," Will observed. "Animals always know," Catherine said, echoing something Frank had written in his journal. "They can sense when someone understands what's really important." Will led Catherine to the disputed section of land, following the path he'd walked countless times as a teenager. As they walked, Catherine told him about her grandmother Margaret, painting a picture of a woman who had never stopped believing that her family's connection to this land was about more than ownership or profit. "My grandmother was part Crow," Catherine explained. Her great-grandfather had been a tribal leader who negotiated with the early white settlers about land use and water rights. The Macready family wasn't just homesteaders. They were guardians of something that the Crow people had considered sacred for centuries. When they reached the old oak tree, Catherine stopped and stood quietly for several minutes, as if listening to voices only she could hear. Will showed her the stone marker he'd discovered that morning, and her reaction confirmed his suspicions about its significance. "This is a boundary marker," she said, kneeling beside the carved stone. The Crow people used these to mark places where the earth and sky were connected, where the spiritual and physical worlds intersected. "My grandmother always said this land was special because it was a doorway, a place where healing and wisdom could flow between the human world and the natural world. Is that why she fought so hard to keep it?" Will asked. Catherine nodded. "She believed that some things are too sacred to be owned, too important to be bought and sold. But she also believed that if her family didn't maintain legal claim to the land, it would eventually be destroyed by people who didn't understand its true value." They stood together in the shadow of the ancient oak, looking out over the rolling hills that would soon be transformed into an industrial mining operation. The irony wasn't lost on either of them in winning the legal battle to reclaim the land. Catherine's family had opened the door to exactly the kind of destruction that Margaret Macready had spent her life trying to prevent. "There has to be another way," Will said quietly. Catherine was silent for a long moment, her hand resting on the carved stone marker. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that reminded Will powerfully of the young woman in Frank's photograph. "Maybe there is," she said. "But it would require both our families to sacrifice everything we think we know about what this land is worth." Catherine stayed at the ranch for 3 days, sleeping in Frank's old room and spending her mornings walking the land with Clementine as her guide. Will watched from the kitchen window as she traced the boundaries of the disputed section, stopping frequently to study the terrain with the intensity of someone trying to memorize something precious before it was lost forever. On her second evening, she asked Will to show her Frank's secret office in the barn. She studied the wall map carefully, comparing Frank's research with documents she'd brought from her own family's archives. What she showed Will that night changed his understanding of the situation completely. "This isn't just about mineral rights," Catherine said, spreading her grandmother's papers on Frank's desk. "It's about water." The documents Catherine had brought were water rights claims dating back to the 1880s, when her great-great-grandfather had negotiated agreements with territorial authorities about access to the underground aquifers that fed Willow Creek and several other waterways in the region. According to these agreements, the Macready family had been granted perpetual rights to the underground water sources in exchange for allowing passage of the Transcontinental Railroad through their traditional hunting grounds. The mining operation isn't just going to extract rare earth minerals, Catherine explained. It's going to require millions of gallons of water for processing and dust control. Western Extractive has already negotiated to tap into the same aquifers my family has controlled for over a century. Will studied the water rights documents with growing amazement. The underground water system was far more extensive than he'd realized, feeding not just Willow Creek, but a network of springs and seasonal streams that supported wildlife and ranching operations across 3 counties. If they drain those aquifers for mining operations, Catherine continued, it will affect water availability for hundreds of square miles. Ranches that have never had water problems will suddenly find their wells running dry. Wildlife migration patterns will change. The entire ecosystem will be disrupted. The implications were staggering. Will had been thinking about the mining operation in terms of landscape destruction, but Catherine was describing something much more far-reaching, an industrial project that would affect the water security of the entire region. Why didn't this come up during the environmental impact assessment? Will asked. Catherine's expression grew grim. Because Western Extractive has lawyers who are very good at compartmentalizing environmental reviews. They filed separate impact statements for the mining operation, the water usage, and the waste management, making it almost impossible for regulators to see the cumulative effect of the entire project. She pulled out another document, this one more recent. But my grandmother's water rights agreements included provisions that require any industrial use of the aquifers to be approved by the tribal authorities as well as state and federal agencies. Western Extractive either didn't know about these provisions or hoped they could proceed without triggering them. Will felt a spark of hope. Does that mean the mining operation can be stopped? Not stopped, Catherine said carefully. But it might mean we have some leverage to negotiate a different approach. That night, Catherine called the tribal council offices on the Crow reservation, speaking in a mixture of English and what Will assumed was the Crow language. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and when she hung up, her expression was thoughtful but cautious. "I've arranged a meeting with the tribal council for next week," she said. "My grandmother's brother's grandson, Robert Prettyfeather, is now one of the tribal attorneys. If we can demonstrate that the water rights issues were never properly addressed, the tribe might be willing to file an injunction to halt the mining operation until a proper environmental review is completed." But even as hope began to build, Catherine was careful to manage expectations. "You need to understand, Will, that this is a long shot. Western Extractive has unlimited legal resources and political connections. Even if we can get an injunction, they'll fight it with everything they have. And my family is still bound by the mining contract. We can't simply walk away without facing enormous financial penalties." Will spent the next several days researching everything he could find about water rights law, tribal sovereignty, and environmental protection regulations. What he learned was both encouraging and discouraging. While tribal water rights were indeed powerful legal tools, they were also complex and frequently challenged by corporate interests, with deeper pockets and more political influence. The breakthrough came when Will was going through Frank's filing cabinet one more time, looking for any documents he might have missed. Hidden in the back of the bottom drawer, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a leather portfolio that contained the most significant discovery yet. Inside the portfolio were the original treaties between the United States government and the Crow Nation, dating from 1868 and 1873. But these weren't copies, they were originals, signed by tribal leaders and federal negotiators, complete with wax seals and official stamps. Along with the treaties were maps showing the original boundaries of tribal territory and detailed agreements about water rights, mineral claims, and land use that had apparently been lost from the official record. Will called Catherine immediately, and she drove back to the ranch that same evening. When she saw the treaties, her hands trembled as she carefully examined each document. "My God," she whispered, "these are the missing documents that my grandmother spent her entire life trying to find." The federal government claimed they were lost in a fire in Washington, but Frank must have somehow acquired them. The treaties revealed that the original agreements between the Crow Nation and the federal government had included much more comprehensive protections for water and mineral resources than anyone had realized. The documents clearly stated that any industrial development affecting the underground water systems would require not just tribal consultation but tribal consent, a much higher legal standard than the mining company had attempted to meet. "This changes everything," Catherine said, studying the treaties with the intensity of a lawyer who just found the smoking gun in a major case. With these documents, the tribal council doesn't just have standing to request an environmental review, they have the legal authority to halt the mining operation entirely unless Western Extractive can demonstrate that their water usage won't affect the tribal water rights. But as Will and Catherine began to understand the full implications of Frank's final gift, they also realized that possessing these documents brought its own dangers. Western Extractive had already invested tens of millions of dollars in the mining project, and they wouldn't surrender those investments without a fight. "We need to be very careful about how we proceed," Catherine warned. Once we reveal the existence of these treaties, we're going to be fighting against some of the most powerful corporate interests in the mining industry. They'll use every legal and political tool they have to discredit these documents or find ways around them. Will looked out the kitchen window at Clementine, who stood near the oak tree as if maintaining a vigil over the land she'd helped protect. The old donkey had led him to Frank's secrets, and those secrets had revealed a path toward preserving the land that might actually work. But the path would require courage, determination, and a willingness to take on opponents with far more resources and experience. Frank carried this burden alone for decades, Will said quietly. I don't want to make the same mistake. Whatever we do it together. Catherine nodded, her grandmother's determination shining in her eyes. Together, she agreed. For the land, for our families, and for all the generations who'll come after us. Outside, the Montana wind carried the scent of snow and the promise of winter storms. But inside Frank's kitchen, warmed by the old wood stove and the shared sense of purpose, Will felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the knowledge that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The phone call came at 5:30 in the morning, jarring Will from the deepest sleep he'd had in weeks. Catherine's voice was tight with anxiety, and she was speaking in rapid bursts that took him several seconds to process. Will, we have a problem, a big problem. Can you get to a computer right away? Will stumbled to Frank's old desktop computer and waited impatiently for it to boot up. Catherine guided him to a news website out of Denver, where the headline made his blood run cold. Environmental protesters attempt to sabotage mining equipment. Federal investigation underway. The article described an incident at a western extractive mining site in Colorado, where someone had attempted to damage heavy machinery and steal geological survey data. The FBI was treating it as an act of eco-terrorism, and the company had announced increased security measures at all their operational sites, including the upcoming Crazy Mountain project in Montana. Keep reading, Catherine said grimly. Further down in the article, Will found the paragraph that explained Catherine's panic. Western Extractive CEO Marcus Holloway announced that the company has discovered evidence of a coordinated effort to interfere with legitimate mining operations using fraudulent historical documents. We've learned that certain activist groups are attempting to manufacture false Native American treaty claims in order to halt lawful development projects, Holloway stated. We're working with federal authorities to investigate these fraudulent documents and prosecute anyone involved in their creation or distribution. Will's hand shook as he read the rest of the article. Western Extractive was claiming that recently discovered fake tribal treaties were part of a broader conspiracy to interfere with mining operations across the western United States. The company had apparently hired forensic document experts and was working with the FBI to identify and prosecute anyone involved in what they were calling treaty fraud. They know, Will said into the phone. Somehow they know about the documents Frank left. It's worse than that, Catherine replied. I just got off the phone with Robert Prettyfeather. Yesterday afternoon, FBI agents showed up at the tribal council offices with a warrant. They seized all the documents related to our water rights claims and informed the council that they were under federal investigation for conspiracy to defraud the United States government. The implications hit Will like a physical blow. Western Extractive wasn't just defending against their legal challenge, they were attacking it preemptively, using the full weight of federal law enforcement to discredit the very documents that could stop the mining operation. How could they possibly know about documents that have been hidden in Frank's filing cabinet for decades? Will asked. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a new edge of suspicion and fear. Will, I need you to think very carefully. Who else knew about our meeting at the ranch? Who else knew that we'd found those treaties? Will tried to remember everyone he'd spoken with since inheriting the ranch. The lawyer who'd handled Frank's estate, the county assessor's office, the librarian in Red Lodge, the various government offices he'd called seeking information about mineral rights and land disputes. "I made a lot of calls," he admitted. "I was trying to understand the legal situation before you arrived." "Did you mention the specific documents to anyone? Did you tell anyone that Frank had left treaties or water rights agreements?" Will's memory was fuzzy, but as he thought back over the conversations, he realized that he had indeed mentioned Frank's papers and documents to several people, including the clerk at the Montana Department of Natural Resources, who had warned him about the complexity of mineral rights disputes. "The state offices keep records of all their phone calls," Catherine said as if reading his thoughts. "If Western Extractive has contacts in state government, and believe me, a company that size has contacts everywhere, they could have learned about our situation within hours of your first phone call." The betrayal Will felt was profound, not because anyone had deliberately deceived him, but because his own naivety had potentially destroyed their only chance of stopping the mining operation. He'd been thinking like a rancher dealing with familiar problems, not like someone challenging billion-dollar corporate interests with unlimited legal resources. But Catherine wasn't finished with her devastating news. "There's something else," she said. "Something that makes me think this situation is much more complicated than we realized." She'd spent the night researching Western Extractive Industries, digging deeper into their corporate structure and leadership than she'd done before. What she'd discovered was that the company's board of directors included 2 former federal officials who had previously been involved in Native American treaty negotiations, including one man who had served as a special advisor to the Bureau of Indian Affairs during the 1990s. Think about it. Will, these aren't just mining executives. They're people who understand exactly how tribal treaty rights work and exactly how to neutralize them. They've been planning for challenges like ours from the very beginning. The picture Catherine painted was of a carefully orchestrated campaign to acquire valuable mining sites while systematically eliminating any legal obstacles that might interfere with extraction operations. Western Extractive hadn't just purchased the mineral rights to the McCready land. They'd researched every possible challenge to their ownership and prepared countermeasures for each one. "The FBI investigation isn't a reaction to our discovery of the treaties," Catherine explained. "It's part of a pre-existing strategy to discredit any tribal treaty claims that might interfere with their mining operations. They probably started building their treaty fraud case months ago, before we ever met." Will felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he'd thought he understood about the situation was being reframed as part of a much larger and more sinister pattern. Western Extractive wasn't just a mining company pursuing legitimate business interests. They were a predatory operation that used federal law enforcement as a weapon against anyone who challenged their plans. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Catherine's response revealed both her legal training and her growing desperation. "We have to assume that every communication we've had is being monitored, that every document we've found is being challenged, and that any legal action we take will be met with overwhelming force. We're not just fighting a mining company. We're fighting a system that's designed to ensure that corporate interests always win." But even as she outlined the hopelessness of their situation, Catherine's voice carried a note of determination that reminded Will powerfully of her grandmother's legacy. "However," she continued, "there is one thing that Western Extractive can't control, one factor they haven't accounted for in all their planning." "What's that?" "The land itself, and the people who understand what it really means." Catherine had been thinking about her grandmother's teachings, about the Crow Nation's relationship with the earth and the spiritual obligations that transcended legal documents and corporate strategies. The treaties were important, but they were just pieces of paper. The real power lay in the connections between people and place that couldn't be bought, sold, or discredited by federal investigators. "We need to change our strategy completely," Catherine said. "Instead of fighting them in courts where they have every advantage, we need to fight them in the court of public opinion, in the realm of spiritual and moral authority that they can't control. Will found himself thinking about Clementine, who had known from the beginning that something important was buried beneath the oak tree. The old donkey hadn't needed legal documents or government approval to understand what needed protection. She'd simply acted on the knowledge that some things were too valuable to be lost. "What are you proposing?" Will asked. "I'm proposing that we stop acting like this is a legal problem and start treating it like what it really is, a spiritual and moral crisis that affects everyone who cares about the relationship between people and the land." Catherine's plan was audacious and risky, but it offered something that legal challenges could never provide: the possibility of touching people's hearts and consciences in ways that corporate lawyers couldn't anticipate or control. "But first," she said, "we need to get those original treaties to a safe place where Western extractive can't seize them or discredit them. Because if we're going to change the narrative about what's happening here, we're going to need evidence that people can see and touch and verify for themselves." Will looked out the window at the land that 4 generations of his family had worked and loved. The land that was now threatened not just by mining, but by a web of corporate and governmental power that seemed impossible to challenge. "Frank," he said quietly, speaking to his uncle's memory and the burden of conscience he'd inherited, "I hope you knew what you were getting us into." Outside, Clementine stood near the oak tree in the early morning light, as patient and determined as ever, as if she understood that the real battle was just beginning. Catherine arrived back at the ranch 2 days later with a small convoy that Will hadn't expected. She brought Robert Prettyfeather, the tribal attorney, along with his grandmother, Agnes Prettyfeather, who introduced herself as a tribal elder and keeper of traditional stories. Also with them was Dr. Sarah Chen, Catherine's sister, who worked as a documentary filmmaker in Portland. "We're going to need help," Catherine explained as they gathered in Frank's kitchen. "And we're going to need to move fast." Agnes Prettyfeather was a small woman in her 70s, with silver hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of generations. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades mediating between the traditional world and the modern one, helping her people navigate the complexities of treaties, land rights, and cultural preservation. "My grandmother told me stories about this place," Agnes said, gesturing toward the window that looked out on the disputed land. "She said it was a place where the earth spoke to people who knew how to listen, where healing waters flowed underground and the spirits of the ancestors watched over the living." Robert Prettyfeather spread tribal maps on the kitchen table, documents that showed the traditional boundaries and sacred sites that predated any European settlement. The maps were hand-drawn on hide and cloth, passed down through generations of tribal historians, and they told a very different story about the land than any legal survey had ever captured. "According to our traditional knowledge," Robert explained, "this entire area was considered a gathering place for multiple tribes. The Crow, the Blackfeet, and the Lakota all came here for ceremonies and healing rituals. The underground waters were considered sacred, and the oak tree that grows on your property was used as a marker for vision quests and spiritual guidance." Will found himself thinking about Clementine's behavior, her persistent attention to the area around the oak tree, and wondered if animals could sense things that humans had forgotten how to perceive. Dr. Sarah Chen had been quietly setting up video equipment while the others talked. And now she spoke for the first time. "We're going to document everything," she said. "The treaties, the traditional maps, the sacred sites, and the stories that explain why this land is important beyond its mineral value. But we're not just making a documentary. We're creating evidence that can't be discredited by corporate lawyers or federal investigators." Her plan was sophisticated and multi-layered. Instead of trying to fight Western extractive in court, where they had every advantage, the group would create a comprehensive digital archive that would make it impossible for the company to control the narrative about what was happening. "We'll live stream the documentation process," Sarah explained. Everything will be broadcast in real time to social media platforms, uploaded to blockchain-based storage systems, and distributed to multiple news outlets simultaneously. Even if they try to seize the original documents or claim they're fraudulent, we'll have created an independent record that thousands of people will have witnessed. Catherine pulled out her laptop and showed Will what they'd already begun. A website called Sacred Waters Montana had been created overnight, featuring a live video feed from the ranch, historical information about the tribal treaties, and a detailed explanation of what the mining operation would do to the local water systems. "We've already got environmental groups sharing the link," Catherine said. "And Robert's been in touch with tribal councils across the region. By tomorrow, we should have representatives from 6 different tribes coming to document their own connections to this land." But Agnes Pretty Feather raised a concern that made everyone pause. "We must be very careful," she said. "Some of the knowledge about this place is sacred, meant only for tribal members. If we share everything publicly, we risk violating our own spiritual obligations." Robert nodded, understanding the delicate balance they needed to maintain. "We'll share what can be shared and protect what needs protection. But we have enough public knowledge to make a powerful case without revealing anything that should remain private." Will felt both inspired and overwhelmed by the scope of what they were planning. These weren't just legal documents they were preserving. They were creating a record of an entire worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between people and land that corporate mining couldn't quantify or purchase. Sarah began filming that afternoon, starting with Agnes Pretty Feather, standing beside the oak tree and telling the traditional stories about the sacred waters and the healing ceremonies that had taken place there for centuries. The old woman spoke in both English and Crow, her voice carrying across the winter landscape with a power that made Will's throat tighten with emotion. "This tree has been standing here for over 200 years, Agnes said, her hand resting on the gnarled bark. "It has seen 7 generations of my people come here seeking wisdom and healing. The waters that flow beneath this ground have blessed countless ceremonies and sustained life during the hardest times our people have ever faced. When you destroy this place for the minerals underneath, you're not just destroying land, you're destroying the spiritual foundation that has sustained entire communities for centuries." Catherine documented the treaties with forensic precision, photographing each page from multiple angles and scanning the documents with equipment that Sarah had brought from Portland. Every step was broadcast live, with a running commentary that explained the historical and legal significance of what they were preserving. But it was Will's contribution that surprised everyone, including himself. When Sarah asked him to explain why he was willing to give up his family's claim to land they'd worked for 4 generations, his answer came from a place of understanding that he hadn't known he possessed. "I grew up on this land," he said, standing in the pasture where he'd learned to work with cattle and understand the rhythms of the seasons. "It shaped everything I know about responsibility, about what it means to take care of something bigger than yourself. My Uncle Frank spent the last years of his life carrying the weight of knowing that our family had built our lives on land that wasn't ours to claim. He couldn't figure out how to make that right, but maybe we can." Will paused, looking out over the rolling hills that would soon be transformed into an industrial mining operation if their efforts failed. "The mining company wants people to think this is about economics, about jobs and tax revenue and mineral resources that America needs. But some things are worth more than money. Some things are too important to be bought and sold. If we let them destroy this place, we're not just losing land, we're losing a part of our souls." The response to their live documentation was immediate and overwhelming. The website crashed twice from traffic, and the video streams were being shared across social media platforms faster than Sarah could track. Environmental groups, tribal organizations, and ranching associations were all sharing the content, creating a level of public attention that none of them had anticipated. But the response from Western Extractive was swift and aggressive. By evening, the company had issued a statement. claiming that the documentation project was a coordinated disinformation campaign designed to interfere with lawful mining operations. They'd also filed emergency motions in federal court seeking injunctions against any further harassment of their project. More concerning was the phone call that came just before midnight. Will answered to find a man's voice, calm and professional, delivering a message that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Brody, this is Marcus Holloway from Western Extractive Industries. I think it's time we had a conversation." Holloway's tone was conversational, almost friendly, but his words carried unmistakable threats. He knew about the documentation project, he knew about the tribal involvement, and he wanted Will to understand that continuing their efforts would have serious legal and financial consequences for everyone involved. "You're in over your head, Mr. Brody," Holloway said. "You're dealing with federal regulations, tribal sovereignty issues, and mineral rights law that you don't understand. The people you're working with are using you to advance their own political agendas. And when this is over, you're the one who'll be left facing criminal charges for interfering with legitimate business operations." But Holloway also offered a way out. Western Extractive was prepared to purchase the Brody Ranch for 3 times its assessed value, enough money for Will to start over anywhere he wanted. All he had to do was walk away from the tribal coalition and stop participating in what Holloway called eco-terrorist activities. "You have 24 hours to decide," Holloway concluded. "After that, we proceed with all available legal remedies." Will hung up the phone and stood in Frank's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his uncle's lifelong struggle with conscience and duty. Outside, he could see the lights from the film crew's equipment, where Agnes Prettyfeather was still telling stories about the sacred significance of the land they were trying to protect. The choice Holloway had offered was really no choice at all. Will could take the money and walk away, leaving others to fight a battle they might not be able to win. Or he could stay and face the full weight of corporate and governmental power that was aligned against them. But as Will looked out at the ancient oak tree, where Clementine stood in her usual vigil, he realized that Frank had already made this choice decades ago. His uncle had chosen to carry the burden of truth rather than abandon his responsibility to justice, even when that burden had cost him everything he might have had with Margaret Macready. Will picked up the phone and called Catherine. "They just made us an offer," he said. "And I think our answer is going to determine whether we're fighting for the land or fighting for our lives." Dawn came grey and bitter cold, with the kind of wind that cut through winter coats and reminded everyone that Montana's weather could be as harsh as its beauty was profound. Will stood on the porch with his coffee, watching a line of vehicles snake up the ranch road through the early morning mist. The tribal coalition had grown overnight. In addition to the Crow representatives, delegations from the Blackfeet, Little Shell, and Fort Belknap reservations had arrived to document their own historical connections to the sacred waters. But they weren't alone. News vans from 3 different television stations were mixed in with the convoy, along with cars carrying environmental activists, ranching families, and what appeared to be federal agents in unmarked vehicles. Catherine emerged from the house with her laptop, her face tight with exhaustion and determination. She'd been awake most of the night, coordinating with legal teams, tribal councils, and media outlets, trying to stay ahead of Western Extractive's aggressive response to their documentation project. "The company filed for an emergency restraining order at 4 this morning," she reported. "They're claiming that our documentation project constitutes trespassing, harassment, and interference with federal mineral rights leases. The hearing is scheduled for this afternoon in Billings." Robert Prettyfeather approached from the barn, where he'd been setting up additional communications equipment. "The FBI showed up at my office in Crow Agency an hour ago," he said. "They have a warrant to seize all documents related to our water rights claims, and they're threatening to arrest anyone who interferes with their investigation." Will felt the walls closing in, but Agnes Prettyfeather's response surprised him with its calm resolve. The tribal elder stood beside the oak tree, seemingly unaffected by the federal agents and corporate lawyers who were gathering like storm clouds around the ranch. "Let them come," she said quietly. "This land has seen conflicts before. It has survived cavalry charges and oil derricks and uranium mining. It will survive this too, if we remember who we really are and why we're here." Dr. Sarah Chen had been live-streaming since sunrise, narrating the arrival of each new group and explaining the escalating legal and political pressures that were converging on the ranch. The audience for the documentation project had grown to over 50,000 viewers, with the video feeds being shared across multiple platforms and translated into several languages. But it was the arrival of Marcus Holloway himself that changed the dynamic completely. The Western Extractive CEO arrived in a black SUV with tinted windows, accompanied by a security detail and what appeared to be federal agents. Holloway was younger than Will had expected, probably in his 40s, with the kind of polished confidence that came from years of getting his way through a combination of money, political connections, and carefully applied pressure. "Mr. Brody," Holloway called out as he approached the porch. "I hope you've had time to consider our conversation last night." Will descended the porch steps slowly, aware that every word and gesture was being broadcast live to thousands of viewers around the world. The weight of the moment felt enormous, not just for his own future, but for the precedent that would be set by how this confrontation was resolved. "I've had time to think," Will replied, "and I've decided that some things aren't for sale." Holloway's smile was thin and predatory. "Mr. Brody, I don't think you understand the legal position you've placed yourself in. By participating in this fraudulent documentation project, you've made yourself an accessory to federal crimes involving treaty fraud, interference with interstate commerce, and conspiracy to obstruct lawful mining operations." He gestured toward the federal agents who accompanied him. "These gentlemen have warrants for the seizure of all documents and recording equipment related to your claims about tribal treaty rights. Anyone who interferes with the execution of these warrants will be subject to immediate arrest." But Agnes Prettyfeather stepped forward before the agents could move, and her voice carried an authority that made everyone pause. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "you're standing on sacred ground that has been blessed by 7 generations of my people. The waters that flow beneath your feet have sustained life and ceremony for centuries. Before you proceed with destroying this place, I'd like you to understand what you're really taking from the world." Holloway's expression didn't change, but Will noticed that the federal agents looked uncomfortable as Agnes continued speaking. "This isn't about money or mineral rights or corporate profits," she said. "This is about the responsibility that each generation has to preserve something sacred for the generations that come after. If you proceed with your mining operation, you'll be destroying something that can never be replaced, not just the land, but the spiritual connection between people and place that has sustained communities for longer than your government has existed." Sarah Chen continued filming as Agnes spoke, capturing the moment when indigenous wisdom confronted corporate power in the most direct way possible. The live stream audience had grown to over 100,000 viewers, and the comments section showed people from around the world expressing support for the tribal coalition. Holloway waited until Agnes finished speaking, then turned back to Will with renewed determination. "Mr. Brody, you have exactly 5 minutes to decide whether you're going to accept our offer and walk away from this situation, or whether you're going to force us to proceed with the full legal consequences of your actions." Will looked around at the faces. Gathered near the oak tree, Catherine, with her legal expertise and her grandmother's determination, Robert Prettyfeather, with his tribal authority and his modern education, Agnes Prettyfeather with her connection to traditional wisdom, and Sarah Chen with her cameras documenting everything for the world to witness. Then he looked at Clementine, who stood near the tree as she had from the beginning, patient and watchful and somehow knowing, as if she understood that this moment would determine not just the fate of the ranch, but the precedent for how Conflicts between traditional values and corporate power would be resolved in the 21st century, Mr. Holloway, Will said finally. I believe you already have your answer. The standoff that followed Will's refusal seemed to stretch across the winter landscape like a held breath. Federal agents fingered their radios, while tribal representatives formed a protective circle around the oak tree. Sarah Chen's cameras continued rolling, broadcasting the confrontation to an audience that had swelled to nearly 200,000 viewers worldwide. It was Clementine who broke the tension. The old donkey suddenly brayed with unusual intensity, then began walking directly toward Holloway and his security detail. Her movement was deliberate and purposeful, and something about her demeanor made everyone stop talking and watch. She approached Holloway without fear or hesitation, studying him with those dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than any human could understand. Then, to everyone's astonishment, she gently nuzzled his hand. Holloway jerked back as if he'd been shocked, his corporate composure cracking for the first time since his arrival. But Clementine wasn't finished. She moved to each of the federal agents in turn, offering the same gentle greeting, as if she was welcoming them to a place where hostility had no power. Agnes Prettyfeather smiled as she watched the old donkey's performance. Animals know when people have forgotten how to listen to their hearts, she said quietly. Sometimes they have to remind us. The moment of confusion gave Catherine the opening she'd been waiting for. She stepped forward with her laptop, addressing not just Holloway and the federal agents, but the cameras that were broadcasting everything live. Before anyone is arrested or documents are seized, she said, I think the world deserves to know what's really at stake here. She opened her laptop and began reading from the original tribal treaties that Frank had preserved, translating the archaic legal language into terms that ordinary people could understand. As she spoke, tribal representatives from each nation added their own voices, explaining what the sacred waters had meant to their communities and what would be lost if the mining operation proceeded. But it was Robert Prettyfeather who delivered the information that changed everything, Mr. Holloway, he said. Yesterday afternoon, the Tribal Council received some interesting documents from the Department of the Interior. It seems that when your company applied for mineral extraction permits, you failed to disclose the existence of sacred sites and tribal burial grounds on the property. Robert held up a thick folder of papers. These are federal survey reports that your own geological teams filed with the Bureau of Land Management. They clearly identify indigenous ceremonial sites and ancient burial grounds throughout the area you plan to mine. Under federal law, any disturbance of these sites requires extensive consultation with tribal authorities and environmental impact assessments that you never completed. Holloway's face darkened as he realized the implications. Those sites were properly reported through all required channels, he insisted. Yes, Robert agreed, but reporting them and obtaining permission to disturb them are two different things. According to the National Historic Preservation Act, any mining operation that affects indigenous sacred sites must be approved by the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. You never applied for that approval. Catherine picked up the thread, her legal training evident in how she explained the situation. What Mr. Prettyfeather is saying is that your company's permits are invalid. You don't have legal authority to proceed with mining operations until the tribal consultation process is completed, which typically takes years and often results in denial of permits for sites of spiritual significance. The federal agents accompanying Holloway began whispering among themselves, clearly recognizing that the legal landscape had shifted dramatically. Sarah Chen continued filming as the corporate certainty that had characterized Holloway's arrival dissolved into bureaucratic confusion. But Holloway wasn't finished. With the cold calculation of someone who had fought these battles before, he played his final card. Even if there are procedural delays with our permits, he said, the fact remains that Western Extractive owns the mineral rights to this property. Whether we extract those minerals this year or next year, the outcome will be the same. You're fighting to delay the inevitable, not prevent it. It was Will who responded, and his words carried the weight of everything he'd learned about legacy, responsibility, and the true meaning of inheritance. Mr. Holloway, you're right that you might own the mineral rights, but you don't own the water. You don't own the air. You don't own the wildlife, migration patterns, or the soil microorganisms, or the underground root systems that connect this land to ecosystems hundreds of miles away. Will gestured toward the oak tree where Agnes Pretty Feather stood with her hand on the ancient bark. You don't own the spiritual significance of this place, or the memories of 7 generations of people who found healing here, or the responsibility that comes with being temporary custodians of something that belongs to all future generations. He paused, aware that his words were being heard by people around the world who were struggling with similar conflicts between corporate power and community values. You can take the minerals and make your profits, Mr. Holloway, but you can't take the meaning of this place. You can't take the stories or the songs or the prayers that have blessed this ground. And you can't take away the fact that people are willing to stand up and say that some things are more important than money. As Will spoke, something remarkable began happening. The vehicles that had been arriving all morning weren't just bringing federal agents and corporate lawyers. They were bringing families, ranchers from neighboring properties, teachers and students from the local schools, elders from multiple tribal communities, people who had heard about the confrontation through the live streams and had driven hours to be present for whatever was about to happen. By noon, nearly 300 people had gathered around the oak tree, creating a human barrier between the mining interests and the sacred site they were trying to protect. Holloway found himself facing not just legal challenges, but a community mobilization that his corporate strategies hadn't anticipated. The standoff continued through the afternoon, with federal agents reluctant to arrest hundreds of peaceful protesters under the watchful eyes of international media. As the sun began to set behind the crazy mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and purple, Holloway finally acknowledged the new reality. "This isn't over, Mr. Brody," he said as he climbed back into his SUV. "Legal delays can only postpone the inevitable." But as his convoy disappeared down the ranch road, Will felt something he hadn't experienced since he was a teenager working alongside Frank in these same fields. He felt like he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was meant to do, connected to something larger and more permanent than any individual life or corporate agenda. The land would endure, the sacred waters would continue to flow, and the story of this day would become part of the larger story that connected past, present and future in an unbroken chain of responsibility and love. 6 months later, Will stood beside the same oak tree where his journey had begun, but everything had changed. The March snow had given way to the tentative green of early spring, and the meadow around the ancient tree was dotted with wildflowers that seemed to celebrate the victory that few had thought possible. The legal battles had continued through the winter, but the combination of procedural challenges, tribal sovereignty issues, and sustained public pressure had eventually forced Western Extractive to withdraw their mining application. The company had quietly sold their mineral rights back to Catherine's family trust for a fraction of what they'd originally paid, cutting their losses rather than facing years of expensive litigation with uncertain outcomes. Catherine visited the ranch every few weeks now, sometimes bringing her children to see the land their great-great-grandmother had fought to protect. She'd established a conservation easement that would prevent any future industrial development while preserving the property's agricultural and spiritual significance for generations to come. The Sacred Waters Montana project had become something much larger than anyone had anticipated. Sarah Chen's documentary had been selected for the Sundance Film Festival, and the live streams from the winter confrontation had been viewed by over 2 million people worldwide. More importantly, the documentation model they developed was being used by indigenous communities and environmental groups across the country to protect sacred sites from corporate exploitation. Robert Pretty Feather had been elected to the Tribal Council, where he'd established a new department focused on protecting traditional cultural sites and water rights. Ignis Pretty Feather continued to visit the ranch regularly, teaching traditional stories to anyone willing to listen and maintaining the spiritual connections that had made the land sacred in the first place. Will had made his own discoveries about what it meant to inherit more than property. The ranch had become a gathering place for people seeking to understand the relationship between land, community, and responsibility. University researchers studied the traditional ecological knowledge that Agnes shared. Environmental lawyers used the ranch as a case study in successful community organizing. Young farmers came to learn about sustainable agriculture practices that honored both productivity and preservation. But it was Clementine who remained the heart of everything that happened at the ranch. The old donkey had become something of a celebrity, featured in magazine articles and children's books about animals who protect sacred places. Visitors always asked to meet her, and she seemed to enjoy the attention while maintaining the dignified patience that had characterized her from the beginning. This morning, Will was expecting a special visitor. Frank's lawyer had called the week before to say that he'd found one final document among his client's papers, something that Frank had apparently intended to be opened only after the situation with the Macready claim had been resolved. The envelope was thick and sealed with wax, marked in Frank's handwriting, "For Will when the land is safe." Inside, Will found a letter written in his uncle's careful script, dated just a month before Frank's death. "Will, if you're reading this, it means you've found the courage to do what I never could. You've chosen justice over comfort, truth over convenience, and the future over the past. I'm proud of you, though I wish I'd been brave enough to stand beside you when it mattered. The ranch is yours now, not because our family ever had a legal right to it, but because you've earned the moral right to be its caretaker. The land doesn't belong to anyone. We belong to it. And our job is to make sure it can sustain life and beauty and spiritual connection for all the generations that come after us. Margaret Macready was the love of my life, though I was too stubborn and frightened to admit it until it was too late. I hope Catherine can forgive an old man's cowardice and understand that everything I did in my final years was an attempt to honor her grandmother's memory and her family's claim to justice. Take care of Clementine. She knew all along what needed to be done, and she was patient enough to wait for someone who could listen to what she was trying to say. Animals understand what we've forgotten, that the earth and everything on it are connected in ways that can't be bought or sold or owned. The most important thing I can tell you is this: you were never inheriting a burden. You were inheriting an opportunity to be part of something larger and more permanent than any individual life. The land will outlast us all, but what we do while we're here determines what kind of world we leave behind. Live well, Will. Love deeply. Listen to the wisdom of people like Agnes Pretty Feather and animals like Clementine. And remember that sometimes the greatest gifts do come disguised as burdens, but only if we have the courage to see beyond the surface of things. With love and respect, Uncle Frank. P.S. There's one more thing buried beneath the oak tree, about 6 feet west of where you found the first box. Clementine will show you when the time is right. Will folded the letter carefully and walked over to where Clementine stood grazing near the oak tree. The old donkey looked up as he approached, and for a moment Will could swear he saw something like satisfaction in her dark eyes. "Well, girl," he said, scratching behind her ears, "what do you say we go see what other secrets Frank left for us?" Clementine snorted softly and began walking toward the western side of the tree, where she immediately began pawing at a spot that looked no different from any other patch of ground. But Will had learned to trust her instincts, and he retrieved his shovel from the barn. What he found this time wasn't documents or treaties or evidence of legal disputes. It was a simple wooden box containing photograph albums that documented the history of the ranch from its earliest days. Pictures of Will's great-grandparents working the land, of Frank as a young man learning to farm from his father, of Margaret McCready visiting the ranch in the 1960s, and dozens of images showing the seasonal cycles of planting and harvesting, birth and growth, that had defined life on this land for 4 generations. At the bottom of the box was a photograph Will had never seen before. It showed Frank and Margaret standing together beside the oak tree, both of them middle-aged and smiling, with Clementine visible in the background. On the back, in Frank's handwriting, were the words, "Some stories have endings we never see coming." Summer, 1987. Will realized that Frank and Margaret had found their way back to each other, at least for a little while, long after their youth had passed and their choices had been made. Perhaps love, like land, was something that could be reclaimed even after it seemed lost forever. As the sun set behind the crazy mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Will sat beneath the oak tree with the photograph albums spread around him. Clementine stood nearby, patient and watchful as always, while the sound of water flowing underground seemed to whisper stories of all the generations who had found meaning and healing in this place. Sometimes the greatest gifts do come disguised as burdens, Will thought, but only if we have the wisdom to recognize what we've really been given and the courage to accept the responsibility that comes with it. The land was safe, the water would continue to flow, and the story would continue, passed from one generation to the next, like an inheritance that grew more valuable with each telling. In the distance, a coyote called across the evening landscape, and Clementine answered with a soft bray that seemed to carry all the contentment of a job well done. The ranch was home again, not just to the people who lived there, but to the connections between past and future that made any place truly sacred. Will Brody had inherited more than he'd ever imagined possible, and he'd learned that the most important legacies can't be measured in acres or dollars. They can only be measured in the love and care we bring to our stewardship of the gifts we've been given, and the courage we show in protecting them for all who come after.